would interact a lot with Anand Mahindra, who till fairly recently was, very much involved, but now he's more at a board level involved in the group. What do you think you've learned from someone like him in terms of not only business, but how to conduct yourself professionally and personally?
One of the challenges in India is, logistics is one of the challenges in India. And if you want to continuously make in India, you have to learn how to move in India. Progress is hard to measure at times, and problems are very easy to see.
Hi Ram, thank you so much. Welcome to the Sensei Kujaku show.
But thank you very much for having me over.
So Ram, there's obviously a lot I want to cover, and there's very specific aspects of the business and your career that I want to cover. But before that, I thought it'd be great if we could just talk in a very overarching sense about Mahindra Logistics and what exactly the company does. So could you give me an overview of the actual business areas of the company, and in a very general sense, what does Mahindra Logistics actually do?
Sure. So Mahindra Logistics is one of the largest integrated logistics company in India. And what that means is we provide a series of different logistics services. We provide contract logistics, where we operate logistics for companies. We provide express logistics services. We provide cross-border logistics. And of course, we provide last mile delivery services, right? So those are the largest parts of the company. In addition to that, we also have a mobility business. If you've heard of Meru, for example, which provides airport transfer services, we provide that, and we also provide some other mobility for enterprises. I think the larger vision is to provide companies and be able to integrate across their supply chain. Because one of the challenges in India is, logistics is one of the challenges in India. And if you want to continuously make in India, you have to learn how to move in India. And so the more we can integrate across these services, I think the more you can create value for customers.
Right. So I think it'd be great if we can actually use an example to better understand what exactly your company does. So let's take an example of a car is being made. Let's, in our example, say Mahindra decides to make a car. So obviously there is ancillary players who provide the parts, and then there is Mahindra that makes the car, and then it is sold. It has to go to a showroom and then eventually get sold. So starting with the ancillary players, what role does Mahindra Logistics play in bringing that to the factory?
Sure. So I think, and I'll kind of overlap it probably with our businesses as well. Yeah. So I think on the inbound side or the incoming side, there are vendors who are both Indian as well as, let's say, international.
Right.
So when components being brought internationally, that's actually done by a cross-border logistics business. They bring it by air or by sea, and they bring it down to a port in India, and then they move it from a port into the plants. Similarly, our domestic third-party logistics business will pick material from vendors and bring it into the plant or into external warehouses from which we'll feed the plant, right? Then in addition to that, once it reaches the plant, we actually provide a lot of in-plant logistics, which is managing the inventory, moving the inventory, feeding the inventory, ensuring that production can actually happen. And once that is completed as a car by manufacturing and then it's kind of shipped out, we actually then handle the outbound logistics, right? And those cars are then taken and delivered to dealers or to stockyards. They're either taken by road or they're taken by rail. So we provide all the entire gamut of services end to end. You typically run a network for a client, right, to do that. Now, once the car is completed, for example, you would still have spare parts which have to be delivered. And spare parts are often not delivered in a full truck because the volume is not large. You supply them in smaller amounts, right, and in a part truckload. And often those spare parts, etc., have to be delivered in a very time-efficient way. So that's called done by express services, and that's another service we provide, right? And of course, for people outside Mahindra, for example, if you are an e-com marketplace whom we work with, then when you are delivering to your household, when the company is delivering to your household, that's work which we do as well, and that's kind of our last mile delivery division, right? So we kind of do the entire gamut of services, and of course, if you are in Mahindra and Mahindra employee or client employee in an IT company, and you have to move employees in and out of those facilities where they work, that's where our mobility business comes in, right? So the idea, as you can see, is to provide an end-to-end capability, and the more we can bring that together, the more we can integrate them together, the better we can provide productivity to our customers.
Right.
And that's essentially what we do.
Right. So there's a lot that you've covered, and I want to ask about specific aspects of what you said. But before we get into any of that, I want to understand more about you and, what's the Ram story? How have you ended up as CEO of Mahindra Logistics? What's your career been like?
Well, I think fairly typical Indian middle class, but finished school and I joined the Tata Group. I was with the group for 3 years. And then moved from that group into Cummins, which is a large international manufacturer of engine and power systems. There are a series of general management roles there, both in India and outside. And then at some point we wanted to relocate back to India, and I thought it was a good time to change industry. So I actually switched from engines and power systems to paper and joined a company called International Paper, which is the world's largest paper and packaging company as we're entering India. And kind of managed the international paper business in India for probably 5 years. Left them and joined Schneider Electric, so again moved industry. Took actually a break for a personal reason, at the end of Schneider. And then when I was coming back to work, I think in some ways Mahindra Logistics was the furthest away from what I'd done earlier. When I was looking at all the things which are available, and that's actually kind of why I chose it. So I think that's been a bit of my history. So I think there's not very little commonality in all of it. So I'd say I think the commonality has always been impact and learning. So I think I like roles where there's a chance to make a big impact. And I think by switching industries, it's allowed me to learn new things, right? Whether it's discrete manufacturing, process manufacturing, now services, and so that's been my story. And I've kind of been lucky enough to find companies which believed in me and gave me those roles.
Right. And what has been your learning that, let's say, setting aside the operational business aspect, but when it comes to people, working with people, dealing with interpersonal issues, often conflict resolution in a sense, what has been your assessment of working with people and all those things, and do you think you've gotten better at that over time?
Yeah, I think hopefully gotten better, right? I mean, the organizations have got larger. I think at least in my experience, I think there are 2-3 things that are important. I think one is just being authentic as a leader, right? I think it's just being yourself is really important. And I think if you're not that, then the organization catches on to that, right? I think that's really important. I think the second thing is really believing the fact that people have talent. I think it's very easy to get too wired up around progress is hard to measure at times, and problems are very easy to see. And that's just not in business. I think it's true with people as well. In reality, I think there's a job for everyone, and every job has some person for it. So it's actually about believing people enough to help find that match, and working with them. And I think the third thing is trying to ensure that you really build an inclusive culture, that people of all views and opinions are accepted. I think an organization should always have a certain healthy level of dissent, right? And that's actually what creates change. And I think as a leader, it is your job to find that space for your organization, to have that level of dissent.
In your experience, speaking of dissent, it's a great party line, right? Like, oh, I love hearing criticism, I love hearing other people's opinions, I encourage my juniors to challenge me. It's a great thing to say. But in your experience, forget yourself, I'm just saying in your experience in life working, a lot of people say those things, but is it actually practiced? Do people actually enjoy being challenged?
I think there's no easy answer to that. I think you're right. It's a bit of there is a bit of kind of dissent washing. I guess is probably the best. I think this is a bit of a party line. You're right. I think all of us like to probably believe that we are what we want to be a little bit, right? So it's hard to do that, and it's hard to do that all the time, right? I think, and you get better at it over time. I think it comes down to a couple of things. I think one is, do you really trust your people? I think a large part of your readiness to look at views is, I think, whether you trust people, right? Because you delegate to a position, but you empower a person. And so if you really can find people whom you trust and you like, I think it is far less of conflict and more of, of conversation and dialogue. So I think finding the right people is very important, right? I think the second thing I think is, learning to become a better listener, right, is important. And the third thing I think what helps is just setting some proper guardrails around it. So it's just because you want to create an organization where everyone's opinion matters, it doesn't mean that there are no rules to it, right? And I think what you want is a culture where, management is not in science. It's kind of an art to some extent, right? It's situational. And so as long as you have a culture where everybody recognizes that there is a call which people have to make, and there's an executive structure to making that decision, and that's respected as well. I think the more the organization respects that, the more I think the organization also respects divergent views, right? Because they have to coexist together. It's hard. I don't think. First, I'm not even very good at it. I'm still getting good at it, right? And the second thing I think is that I don't think it comes off a playbook. I think it's something, because I think your style and your temperament are so intrinsic to that. Right. That I think each person has to find their own way to some extent to do it.
Right. So just coming back to your story, so you joined Mahindra Logistics in 19, I think?
Yeah, 4 years.
Yeah, so 4 years. And is it fair to say that in the 4 years that you've been there, the company is continuing and has undergone a great deal of change and transformation, and in many ways, maybe the fundamental model of the business has also changed. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed externally, and obviously we've established we've established an internal response to it, which I think repivots a lot of areas of the business in terms of our perimeter, right, what we do and how we do it. But of course, it still retains much of the culture which we believe is intrinsic to both the company and the group.
Right. So let's talk more about the actual business of Mahindra. And like you said, there's broadly speaking 2 divisions within the company. There's logistics and third-party logistics and everything that you explain. And there's a smaller component which is, I think it was originally called people, transport, mobility. Now it's basically EMS or something. Is that what it's called? Yeah. So I want to actually focus on the larger part of the business, which is your logistics, third-party logistics. There's something that I find very interesting about businesses like that, which is, it's so easy to think that these are sort of old school businesses. There's not much innovation. There's nothing new happening. People are just keeping the wheels turning. But actually, there's a great deal of innovation that happens in these sorts of quote unquote boring businesses, right? People are always trying to find more efficient ways, different ways of doing things. And one idea that came about, I think historically it was there, then was forgotten, and in some ways has made its way back, is the difference between the hub and spoke model versus a mesh model. How do you compare and contrast those 2 models? What do you see as the advantages of each of them? And do you think that one is just truly inherently superior to the other?
So I think first, both the hub and spoke and mesh are most dominantly for time-defined express deliveries, right? It's not really so relevant for a full truckload business. When you're moving material full truckload, I think it's a point-to-point delivery, and you don't actually run a hub and spoke or a mesh of any kind. So in the express business, I think it comes down to I think both models have their value, right? The hub and spoke is an evolutionary system, and of course, I think what it does is gives you far better clarity around how the network will operate. It is less dynamic, and therefore it probably is, it is not always cost efficient all the time, right? Because you are often running a network with lower utilization. So just like most airlines, for example, run in a similar way, and you run a network, and then how well you can get your load factor on that is actually what then drives your value creation. But the positive side of it, your network is very predictable, right? A mesh, I think, is a lot more dynamic as a network, right? Because you are continuously rebalancing your lanes for the loads you have, right? And I think it works brilliantly if you have the right load characteristics in your network, right? Because so both of them, I think, are a function of the load on the network. Right, and I think and companies will evolve over time. So for example, before we bought In our own express business, we had a small express business for a long time, for the last 4 years, and we bought, November last year, we bought our Rivigo's express business, and what we ran was a semi-mesh. Right, we ran a semi-mesh because we had some part of our lanes which are very structured on a hub and spoke, and a lot of which was quite dynamic. And then as we bought the Rivigo business, we actually have transitioned to a much more pure hub and spoke.
You've transferred Rivigo's mesh into hub and spoke.
We had so MLL had a mesh.
Right. Okay.
So at Mahindra Logistics, we actually had which is something like a mesh, not a pure mesh network. And then we have now transitioned with the acquisition to pure hub and spoke. Okay, so I think it's an issue of what conditions and what are the variables you're operating your network on. I think that's true in general of all of logistics. Right, I think logistics is not. I think the use cases are widely varied. Right, and the use cases often, and the variables which are affecting you change by time of day. Right, and therefore it is not one size fits all. Right, a lot of this actually fits circumstances. Right, so today, based on a certain load pattern and a certain demand and a volume trajectory pattern, I might actually prefer a mesh. Right, and tomorrow I might actually say that in a very different set of conditions and hub and spokes better. So I don't think there's any. I think the inherent advantages to both network, but I don't think any one network is inherently better. Right, I think the one thing which which I think in a mesh network which is almost necessarily required is technology. Right, because you're dynamically rebalancing or the direction of your network continuously. You need to have great technology to be able to manage it, right? And then you need to be able to ensure that your asset categories are the sweet spot in terms of operational efficiency. Because you just need to ensure that you're picking the right asset efficiency in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of turnaround time, because you're taking, top of that's where the value gets created. So I think it's horses for courses.
Right. And so speaking of technology, that's, like you said, it's an incredibly important aspect of not only the hub versus mesh sort of differences, but just generally for your business. And I imagine that a company like Mahindra Logistics is constantly investing in that. And, especially in recent times, there's a lot of, talk about AI and how, that can help companies that are in logistics and various other sectors. But could you explain more the kind of developments that you've seen in recent times on the technology front and how they have in different ways changed your business?
So I think if you look at it intrinsically, right, where tech comes in is two places, either in terms of customer service, right, or cost to serve, right? So if you take customer service, for example, today if you look at what's happened after online or e-commerce has come, I think, customer expectations in terms of delivery speed, visualization of their experience has increased dramatically, right? And technology is very important because if you buy something now, you want to be able to track it from supplier to all stages of the supply chain. And technology is very important to give you that visualization, but also, and then drive the quality of the experience, right? Where you can ensure that your deliveries are tracked. And if you have a problem with your package, you can raise a complaint immediately. So the ability to give that customer experience in what is fundamentally a very disaggregated supply chain. I think tech actually plays a very important part in that, and I think that's been one area where a huge amount of work has happened in technology, right? Especially as you look at the growth in last mile delivery. Because that's one space where I think that converts very actively into customer experience, right? So that's one area. The other one area is actually been cost to serve, right? And I think that's an area where, in some ways, logistics companies have always been doing it. Probably not every logistics company. We are an industry which is very layered, right? So there are people who just own assets, who just run fleets, who provide services on top of that. But there are companies who have always been doing that. There's been express companies, cross-border logistics companies, and they all have been investing in technology because that's what improving your load characteristics on your vehicles, improving the way your route is optimized, ensuring that you are traveling the least miles you're running the least miles on your vehicle. I think technology helps you do all of that and ensure there's lesser damages to the product. So in that sense, I think logistics companies have always probably been dabbling a lot in technology. I mean, that's not that everyone in the industry does it, and and I think in India we have a conventional frame of reference, which is it's just trucks, and it's just somebody who owns a bunch of trucks and drives them on the road. But I think there's a fair amount of work which goes behind it, and people have always been trying new things. I think the last few years, obviously, whether it's AI, ML, blockchain, right, I think we've seen a continuous progression of adoption of all these technologies, right? And a lot of that's actually been in the freight optimization space, because that's where people are. We find, I think all of us find there's an opportunity to run the assets a lot better, improve turnaround time, and as infrastructure in India gets better, it's going to be very important to be able to have that capability. Because even the infrastructure is good, if you don't know how to use it, it's not of any value.
Yeah.
Right. So I think across the board, I think what has been still lagging in India has been automation on the floor.
Okay.
Because typically in India, demand.
Sorry, you mean like within the factory?
Within the warehouses,
yeah,
right?
Within the
warehouses, within hubs, etc. Because I think that's where the volumes are not big enough, and demand is very dispersed, and therefore the ability to automate that is actually a lot lesser because we are not able to find the business cases to do it. Some of it's because of lack of access to technology, some of it's because of the absence of technology, right? But the economics actually has been a factor. But I think as scale increases, that will actually solve for itself.
Yeah, and has GST, maybe not as yet, but is that sort of an integral game changer on this front, which is freight optimization and building scale? Because I mean, in a very basic sense, the idea is that with GST, you can essentially have larger warehouses. Instead of having two smaller ones, you can have one larger one, and therefore optimization becomes easier. Has that in any way changed the game?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think GST has been a big change for the industry. I think we've not seen the full shift happening, but I think what GST has allowed companies to do is to reimagine their networks, right? Traditionally, because you designed, the biggest criteria you use to design your network is actually commercial considerations, right, around taxation and everything else. So typically you had a very layered structure or tiered structure where you had warehouses in each state, you had inventory in each state, right? And it was very difficult to move material across states. So even if you had material, let's say in Andhra and you have an order in Telangana, just moving from Andhra to Telangana would be very hard. So you'd rather just bring it back from the central warehouse, right? I think what GST has allowed you to do is break through some of those barriers, right? One, in terms of creating larger facilities which consolidate more demand and fulfill them. And therefore it allows you, I think, to build a lot more scale and leanness into your operation. I think the other thing it's allowed to do is look at the whole nation more as a network, which is non-linear, right? So as an example, if you have orders in Calcutta and you think the material is there in Bihar, in Patna, you can actually move stuff from Patna to Calcutta much more easily today post GST, right? And so those are the benefits which you've got. Now, has it fully fulfilled its potential? No, because I think as we have done those reimagining those networks, we have found new barriers. Right, so earlier you moved everything into a state, and then the distribution from that was also in the state. Now, while we have cut down the one lane down, we have also realized now this facility which serves 3-4 states actually has to be able to do that with equivalent or better tact than earlier. And that's been things which people are trying to fine tune and calibrate. So I think it's been a learning process, but I think GST has been a big game changer for the industry.
Yeah, and you spoke about last mile, and I think that's a really interesting part of your business. There's, like you said, there's two businesses that you have in that, which is Wizard and now with Rivigo. Could you talk about the kind of challenges that you face in last mile, and whether you think that last mile is on its way to being fully solved?
So I think last mile is still, I think probably from a dollar perspective, is probably the largest part of supply chain costs in many ways, and it doesn't matter how you define last mile. I think every company has a last mile, whether it's to distributor, to retailer, or actually to the end customer. We have a couple of businesses. We have a last mile delivery business, which is a B2C business, which is really what we call B2C delivery business. We still work with enterprises, but we do end customer deliveries for them. So these are FMCG companies and largely e-com companies. And some part of that business is hosted inside Mahindra Logistics as an entity, and some part of it is the investment we made in a company called Wizard, middle of last year. And Wizard largely does smaller packages. We do probably, I think, around 7 to 8 crore packages a year in terms of end customer delivery out of those businesses, and that ranges from everything from small packet which will deliver up to televisions, washing machines, refrigerators, and so on. I think the challenge in that last mile delivery space is one of two things. I think one is I think is one of economics, right? While there is a huge opportunity for optimization there, I think there is still a lot of variables which need to be managed. For example, going from South Bombay to the suburbs means very different things based on the time of day you're traveling, right? So I think there's a lot of variables which one has to look at, and so I think the optimization potential is still very much work in progress, and figuring out how to make that profitable and viable, I think is an issue. I think the second thing which I think is a challenge is whether the infrastructure to support it in terms of space for warehousing and so on, which I think that's the second challenge. The third challenge is people. Because with last mile you have these thousands of new drivers, right? And the great thing about this is that you are taking a lot of people and giving them formal employment. I mean, you have drivers who are 12 standard with a license, right? And now this person is potentially going to make much more than they have made otherwise, right? So there's a huge empowerment story to it as well, right? We have delivery associates who are transgenders. There are a large amount of women in our delivery organizations and growing. So I think there's a huge empowerment story to it, but also at the same time there's also an equity story to it, right? In terms of working conditions, in terms of ensuring fair pay, and that's again another thing which I think the industry is trying to figure out, right? I think at an overriding level the largest problem is profitability, right? Because because it still costs a certain amount of money to do last mile delivery, and you have to carry a certain amount of order size. And if the orders become very thin in the thickness, then I think your profitability becomes a larger issue.
So for that reason, is last mile, as in does Mahindra focus last mile only in major urban areas?
No, I think we are focused across the board. I think what we are, I think we've chosen segments and business lines.
Okay.
So typically in the last mile business, you can do it as a delivery as a service, which is just providing clients delivery associates, right? You can do distribution as a service, where you actually run a delivery station, right? Plus the delivery into your home, right? Or you can actually do fulfillment as a service, where you actually take the orders and do the tech and everything else. Our focus largely has been on distribution and fulfillment. Okay. So we don't generally provide plain vanilla delivery service. So we don't provide a company, for example, 100 delivery associates. We normally will run delivery stations and do the deliveries from them, right? So our focus clearly has been to do more value-added work, where our ability to manage people, manage the asset, manage to use technology is far better. The second big focus for us at last mile has been electric, right? So we at Mahindra Logistics do believe the last mile will be electric in the long run.
No, sorry, is that just from a cost angle that there's a massive cost benefit to doing that, or just also just you have to change with the times?
I think sustainability is an business imperative because it's got very good economics. And it does have very good economics, right?
But it has good economics today, or has the potential to have good
today
economics?
Today as well. So today, for example, we are a business division which we call EDEL. We own around 1,400 electric vehicles.
Right.
We operate in 19 cities. We've done more than 25 million kilometers in the last 18 months since we launched the service, right? And we provide customers the entire vehicle. We provide them package-based delivery, and on both of those, I think our economics of electric are comparable with ICE. Not a significant difference, right? So I think it's that's what we have to figure out as well. And I think the challenge for the logistics industry is how to answer that question, right? Because we have to take the discussion from electric being a premium, right? Because today that's the general mindset people have is that, hey, listen, if it's going to be electric, it's going to be premium. And I think in cargo that's not actually true. Okay. I think unlike passenger vehicles, right? In cargo, I think you can actually create models through which you are able to operate the vehicles better and get enough earnings from it. Okay. Right? But that's a big shift which we're seeing, and today probably 30% of our last mile fleet, the total amount of assets we operate, owned and others, is electric already. And I do believe that as more products come in, As we get a 1-ton or a 2-ton electric vehicle and we get smaller, more reliable two-wheelers, I think this shift will actually accelerate. Right. So that's a big play we made, and we decided 2 years ago to try and be an early mover.
Okay.
And so we actually said we're going to build out the electric-based last mile business, and that's when we started retail. Right. And so it's been very successful for us, and we're very happy about that. And I do believe that shift is going to be one which will stay in the long term, and it'll be driven by economics. It won't be driven by conscience.
Right. It has to be, right? I mean, eventually, it's not a charity, right? It's a business that has to be run.
And I think for our customers as well. I think when our customers, I think we can provide them EV-based services which are comparable in cost.
Tell me something. If a customer, let's say I'm an FMCG company and I'm using eDel, then can I use the fact that your vehicles essentially as a sort of carbon offset for my business? Can I count it as that?
Yeah, based on how we manage the declarations and so on. So
there's a massive incentive from the customer's end to hire someone like you versus the traditional ICE guy.
Especially in scope 3, and of course we are ICE as well. But I think especially in scope 3, right? So typically these would be outsourced services, and for most of our clients, many of them will count under their supply chain carbon footprint or under outsourced services. But as scope 3 becomes more and more relevant, this is going to be a big issue, right? And therefore they at least under the right qualifications, they obviously can take credit for it.
And would you say Mahindra has a head start, as in Mahindra Logistics has a head start on this front?
I would say we are the largest player today, right? We are in both, not just in terms of volume of vehicles, but also in terms of the reach across the country.
And it's a sort of head start that it's tough to catch up once someone has a head start, right? Is that fair?
Well, I don't know. I think there's some really interesting models out there. I think we have a model. I think there's some other models as well, which are really interesting. And I think the space is large enough for everyone to play. Right, so I won't say that it is, I think we're in a good place.
Right. So you spoke about Rivigo, which is an acquisition you guys did last year. And I don't know if Rivigo pioneered it or just they're the guys who made it famous, but they had this relay model where, driver A would take it from, to this point, then driver B would get on. And so that basically you could sweat that asset more is the basic crux of the matter. Has that model continued? Have you all changed that in any way? Or have you all found that it's a really great model to use?
So I think Rivigo used that model largely when they own their own assets. Okay, so today what we acquired from them was the part truckload business, which is almost completely asset light.
Okay.
Right. So in that sense, therefore, it is not our fleet anymore. It's not our fleet, and therefore it's not like we are doing double drivers ourselves. What we are doing is we're encouraging our customers to do it. Our vendors to do it. So more and more of our vendors are doing the relay model, but it's not always going to work perfectly, right? The challenge in a relay model is that you have to be able to send the drivers up and down in a very predictable way, right? And in India, that often doesn't work. So the vehicle, let's say, goes from Bombay to Bangalore, and then it goes from Bangalore to Hyderabad. So in relay model, I got to move the vehicle, stop it halfway through, switch drivers. That leg is okay. But then the leg from, let's say, Dharwad to Bangalore, and the vehicle lands up in Bangalore. And then from Bangalore, it has to go to Hyderabad. And now this driver is actually not used to that, right? Because he's hoping he can come back. So I think relay is a function again of how the network is operating. But it is a very powerful thing in terms of how much of efficiency you can get. Mind you, I think road infrastructure in India is improving dramatically.
Do you find that on the ground?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is one of the most significant transformations we will see. And therefore, transit times, I think just because the quality of the infrastructure will come down substantially. Right? So two things are happening, right? I think one is that the road infrastructure is getting better. The second is vehicles are getting better. You may have noticed, I think a couple of weeks ago, Mr. Gadkari actually announced a new rule about air conditioning for all the trucks as well. Okay. So as quality environment gets better for drivers, and the vehicles get much better, the roads get much better, I think we'll actually start seeing that things are moving faster by themselves. Right? In India, drivers work some of the longest hours in the world. Right? It's a great irony, and therefore I think while it is good to use things like double relay driving and so on, I think the real question to ask is how many kilometers do you do in an hour? Because if I can do the right amount of kilometers an hour, then I actually don't need relay drivers. I just need the drivers have rest.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And if I can give them that rest, then it's kind of okay.
Yeah, and in fact, on that key metric, I don't know what the latest data is, but I think it's roughly India is at like 1/3 of many advanced countries, right? In terms of kilometers per day a truck goes on average, and
It's a moving. It's a number which is getting better, right? I think, but I think it's still.
but is it getting better fast enough?
It's hard to say because assets are also have been designed a little bit for this, right? But I think what has happened, I think what's been positive first, a lot of overloading has come down, which used to slow down vehicles. Number one. Number two, I think transit times on road with things like toll booths, all the entry pass issues and all that have come down. They've not been eliminated, but they have come down, right? And that's taken a bunch of downtime off the drivers. I think the roads allowing you to drive faster, I think has also happened, especially in many locations. And I think today, today I think it's a perceptive and a really visible change.
And do you think the freight corridors? Do you think it's a good idea?
Great thing. So I think see, India has a very large amount of road surface, probably the largest in the world. Right? Generally, across the world, there is much moves by rail.
Right.
Right? Then it happens in India. Typically, rail should at least be 40% of the movement. In India, it's much lower, right? And part of the reason for that has always been that our freight network is a passenger network. We inherited from the British days, and it was designed to move passengers and not to move cargo. I think what DFCs do is they solve for that. And by creating dedicated freight corridors, now your trains have dedicated lines. You don't have to wait for passengers. You don't have to wait for those kind of criteria. And that I think is a very big positive, right? Also things like the vehicles, the power system for the DFCs is different, so you can actually add more layers. You can go double decker, even triple decker, and those are all I think significant benefits. I think it's about getting the freight corridors fully done. It'll be a few years I think before they're fully done. And once they're done, I think what you will find is a lot of long haul distances. Typically in our estimate, anything more than 800 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, anything north of that, the economics of rail will be better. Anything less than 1,000 kilometers, I think road will still be very popular because you don't have to take it to a railway station. I mean, whatever it is, I think what's going to happen in the rail system is you have to still have the physical movement from your plant or your facility into the railway station, and then back from the railway station to where you need to sell the product. So that issue will still be there. So there's a distance trade-off, but I think 800 to 1,000 kilometers below is surface, we believe will be road. Right. And above that, we think will fundamentally move to rail.
Right. So I just wanted, you had mentioned earlier something about warehousing. I mean, it's some ways, at least for me, like looking outside, there's I always think of these sort of businesses. How are things improving, right? You're constantly, the efficiency is so important in those sorts of businesses. So let's say in the last 4, 5, 7, 8, 10 years, how do you think the warehousing business has changed? Has robotics played a big part, or do you think that's still in some sense some time away?
Yeah, warehouses across the industry, I think still pretty much are still manual.
Yeah.
I think warehousing in India has moved from.
But even even a really like say an Amazon or like that category of company, like
No, there are cases of people who do. I mean, there's a range,
So
right? There is a range, but I think the dominance of the industry has moved from very manual to I think mechanization.
Okay.
So there are more sorting systems, there are more flow through, conveyors, obviously a lot of electric, material, MHE movement material. So I think that level of transition has happened. But if you typically can have a mental image of a large amount of robotics, right, and UAVs and AGVs, etc., on the floor, I think that's not happened yet. And this, the reason for that, as I said earlier on, is because they require scale.
Right.
I mean, each of these are actually ways to get you higher scale at lower cost. And in India, very often those that volume is not there, right? In India, by nature, is a far more dispersed demand. It's not concentrated demand, and you might be surprised because we have 140 crore people. So you say, how can it not have density, right? But the reality, I think, is a very dispersed demand structure, and that actually affects the ability to create large facilities. Which can have this level of technology.
So the key takeaway from this is just how important scale is in this business, right? For each individual company, it's like I remember, I think maybe it was just before the pandemic. Kumar Mangalam Birla was, I don't know, in some annual report, I don't know what he was writing. He's like, scale is not the most important thing; it's the only thing. it is so important that all companies, especially in a business like yours, that they have tremendous scale. So I want to get a sense of, do you think that I'm seeing the logistics in a very broad sense, that space, do you think it's ripe for consolidation? That maybe there's too many players, there's too many sort of, guys with like 3 trucks, 5 trucks, or doing smaller, just one warehouse somewhere or something like that, and it requires like at a very large scale consolidation to really build these massive businesses?
No, I think there's some benefit, but scale, I think, in my view, in our industry, is two things: is volume and it's connectivity.
Okay.
Right. So it's not just about having volume. Right. It's not about I have 1,000 trucks. It's actually about ensuring that you're connecting India enough. Because as you connect India enough, you can actually get more productivity and more volume going through that network. Okay. Right. So in our industry, I think there is a clear need to have scale, right? But it also, I think, is something that we be careful about, because I think logistics in general is oceans of revenue and islands of profits, right? And therefore, I think scale can sometimes be a misnomer, because ultimately even if you have 500 trucks or 1,000 trucks, those vehicles are on road, right? And they're just on road, right? So just having scale does not mean that your truck goes faster. Right. I mean, because you have 500 trucks versus 200 doesn't mean you're going faster, right? So to that extent, I think you get benefits in purchasing. You get benefits. So I think to me, scale therefore is in our industry. I think it's three things. It's the sheer volume of your operation. It's the technology to make that volume pay, right? To make that volume efficient and productive. And the third one is you're able to connect the country more. The more connections you have. So at MLL, when we again focused on scale, and we have a deep belief that we must make scale profitable and not scale up what is profitable, right? So we have in each of our businesses, smaller businesses, made a bit of that call. And even if there's a burn on those businesses, we're investing because we are confident that as scale gets built out, there will be strong economics to the business. But we are building that not just in terms of an order board, or in terms of volume of the business, but actually in terms of other things. And can we have technology which allows us to manage our assets better all the time? And the second thing I think is, can we actually use technology to drive connectivity across the country better? Because ultimately the two things you don't want to have, right? You never want to have space you don't want to have a warehouse which is full, right? And you don't want to have a vehicle which is standing, right? And if you can solve for that, I think you will get a large part of the scale issues out of it.
Right, so it's very interesting. You're talking about profitability, and I mean, it's not really your business, but in the US, what turned out to be a massive game changer for the railroad business was precision scheduling railroading, where the entire model was changed, right? The balance of power between the service provider and the consumer, the customer, was actually shifted. So do you think that some sort of model change in terms of how things are scheduled, how things actually operate on the ground, do you think there's scope for something like that which can dramatically change the potential for profitability for a company like you?
Well, I think that potential exists, and that probably is the largest business case for consolidation.
Right.
And because trade, one of the challenges of a very fragmented market is it's very able to get that scale to do that work. I think the potential exists. We as an asset-light company are more focused on getting our partners to be able to do that for themselves.
Sorry, when you say partners, you mean
transporters.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So as you know, we don't really own any of the assets. It's a very small part. Yeah. So these benefits actually flow into our partners. So we spend a lot of time on educating them on how to do that, and hopefully, as they do more of it, there'll be benefit.
Right. Right. Well, Ram, I want to end with again taking you back to a little more sort of your own profession, and obviously, given the group you're in, you would interact a lot with Anand Mahindra, who till fairly recently was, very much involved, but now he's more at a board level involved in the group. What do you think you've learned from someone like him in terms of not only business, but how to conduct yourself professionally and personally?
But I think, I know not just in the context of Mr. Mahindra, but I think across the group, there is an ethos which drives the Mahindra Group. Right. And I think at the core of it, very importantly, is this belief in the dignity of the individual, right? And if you come into the group, you'll see this famous ad which we released out when the company was formed, right? And I think there are two parts to it which are very important. One, I think, is that the Mahindra story is not independent of the India story. The company formed roughly at the same time, with a vision to kind of help India industrialize itself. right? And that still remains, I think, very core to the ethos of the group. And the second one is this belief in the dignity of the individual. And that, I think, begins with the way you kind of lead and you manage people, right? So I think being able to respect people and building an environment which is inclusive, which is participative, right? And I think that's very core to the Mahindra Group, right? And therefore, I think so that's, I think, is the biggest learning you will have. It's you know, I think how you do things is far more important than what you do, right? And I think as long as, and that finds many forms of expression in the group, right? But I think that belief that the individual is, that the dignity of the individual is very important, and there's a great power in the individual, right? I think are two very core things which, you know, when I came in from outside the group, those are two things which attracted me to the group, and I think that's the two things which I think mold the way you lead in the group, right? I think obviously Anand or Anish and I think many of our leaders are great examples of that, and I think there are many of them who many of us obviously are trying to learn and follow from. But yeah, I think that's what I think keeps it. And to me, that's what I think sticks out.
Yeah. And I'm going to end with one question. You've used this word multiple times through this conversation, which is inclusion. And I think I've seen it, you know, for example, in social media with your, I'm saying specific, not just Mahindra, I'm saying Mahindra Logistics. There's tremendous emphasis on this, right? That this is a workplace for everyone. Everyone's welcome. We're not discriminating. All these things that I think are really important in this day and age. So why is it that is so important to you and the company as a whole?
Well, so I think it's not a day and age thing alone, but I think for us as a company, you know, we are, you know, I think there are multiple reasons why. I think we want to reflect the world around us, right? And the world around us is not stereotyped in one pattern. You know, I mean, look at our business today. We have 900 locations across the country, right? From Arunachal Pradesh to the, you know, the far extremes of Gujarat, down from Tamil Nadu to Jammu and Kashmir. And so, you know, we are a very diverse business, right? And unless we reflect the diversity of the world around us, I think it's very hard to be successful. It's very hard to be successful because it's very hard to be empathetic if you don't actually have that diversity. I think the second thing why it's very important is I think, you know, it's hard to be innovative if you don't actually have different strands of thinking inside. And in some form, the best way to create that balance on thinking is to have people of different backgrounds and different preferences and different choices, because they intrinsically come with different mental frames, and therefore they bring that they bring different thinking in, and that's what will kind of create innovation. And I think those are, I think, two really good business reasons to do it, right? I think ultimately it's also just the right thing to do, right? I mean, there is no demographic or any other stamp to the ability of a person. As I mentioned earlier, I think to me the Mahindra Group at its core ethos has got a lot about the dignity of the individual, and I think respecting that dignity is just the right thing to do. So yeah, that's in the end probably the best reason to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation of the Mahindra ethos, right? We did it because it's the right thing to do. Well, Ram, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. It's such an interesting space, and I'm so glad you decided to come on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.